Lecture 81, Betrolt Brecht.
I think they'll set him free. Thank God they're open to bribery. They're not wolves, they're human and out for money. Bribe-taking in humans is the same as mercy in God. It's our only hope. As long as people take bribes, you'll have mild sentences, and even the innocent will get off once in a while. Thus speaks the title character in Mother Courage and Her Children, a play of 12 scenes written by Betrolt Brecht in the fall of 1939 and first performed in Zurich the following spring. Starting in Sweden and making its way through an ultimately devastated Germany, the play represents a dozen years sliced from the middle of the 30 Years' War in the early 17th century. This was a time when Catholic forces of the Holy Roman Empire fought the Protestant nations of the North. But this play makes us see war through the eyes of the little people that history typically forgets: foot soldiers, sergeants, peasants, chaplains, and camp followers. The camp followers include not just a prostitute named Yvette, but a canteen woman, a Lutheran Swede named Anna Fearling, who makes her living off the war by buying and selling goods, anything from boots to brandy, that she hauls around in a covered wagon behind the troops. Since her horse has croaked, the wagon is pulled by her two grown sons, illegitimately fathered by a Finn and a Swiss. She rides inside with her mute 25-year-old daughter, whose father is German. Mother Courage won her nickname, she says, by driving her wagon through cannon fire with 50 loaves of moldy bread. In spite of her nickname, she's anything but fearless when an army recruiter comes for her two sons. She doesn't want them to go because she's sure they'll die if they do. But they join up anyway, and in scene 3, a Catholic regiment captures her younger son, I should say. Named Swiss Cheese, he's the paymaster of the 2nd Finnish Regiment, so he's been traveling with the regimental cash box. When he hides it away, instead of giving it to the Catholics, they sentence him to be shot. And that's when Mother Courage shows that she knows how to do business. Quickly raising 200 guilders from the sale of her wagon, she sends Yvette off to find out how much money the soldiers will take to set her boy free. And she's confident they can be bought. Thank God they're open to bribery, she says. Bribe-taking in humans is the same as mercy in God. It's our only hope. Betting her only hope on the power of bribery rather than on the mercy of God or humankind, Mother Courage tells us that she is anything but sentimental. But she's still caught up in hope at this point, and I'm going to leave her there for a little while. Before we say whether or not her bet paid off, I want to consider what Betrolt Brecht brought to the writing of this play. When he started writing it in late September of 1939, he was 41 years old and internationally known as a playwright, but living in exile from his native Germany, where Hitler and his Nazi party had made life impossible for anyone who dared to think for himself. Brecht learned early on how to think for himself and make others think. Born in the Bavarian city of Augsburg in 1898, he was the eldest son of a paper factory clerk who worked his way up to sales director by the time Betrolt was 14, and who thus exemplified the bourgeois respectability that his son would come to loathe. But his mother touched his heart and took charge of his early education. Though his father was a Catholic working in a predominantly Catholic city, Betrolt and his younger brother were raised as Protestants by their Protestant mother, who steeped them both in the Lutheran Bible and sent them to a Protestant elementary school. All of this may help to explain Brecht's fascination with Scripture and wars of religion. His first play, which he wrote at the age of 16, was called simply The Bible. His next major work gave the Bible a pagan twist. A semi-autobiographical expressionist play called simply Baal, it was named for the fertility god of the Old Testament. But its title character is a modern writer who flaunts his sexual appetites, his craving for nature, his hatred of bourgeois convention, and his contempt for sentimentality. Written in little over a month and then reworked with the help of an artist friend named Caspar Neher, the play was published in 1922 when Brecht won the Kleist Drama Prize for Baal and another play. Brecht liked to adapt and to collaborate. Working with the composer Kurt Weill in the late 1920s, he turned John Gay's 18th century Beggar's Opera into the piece that made him internationally famous, the Three-Penny Opera, first performed in Berlin in 1928. In the same year, Brecht fully embraced communism and the gospel of Karl Marx, which meant not only dedicating himself to the fight against capitalism, but also joining a dramaturgical collective started in Berlin by a resolutely Marxist director named Erwin Piscator. During the year that he worked with Piscator, Brecht imbibed his hatred of bourgeois theater and its private little box of illusion. As a result, he took his own work outside that box to create what he called epic theater, which aims to keep the audience at arm's length, to keep us from identifying with the main character. But this was not an easy task for anyone committed, as Brecht was, to celebrating the revolutionary power of socialism. Three of the plays that he wrote in the 1930s show how fully he endorsed at this time the gospel of Marx according to Lenin, who founded Bolshevism in 1903. Marx urged the workers of the world to unite against capitalism and thereby shed their chains. Lenin preached that only violent revolution could make this happen. Brecht first staged this argument, so to speak, in a play called St. Joan of the Stockyards. Set in Chicago, it was written in 1930 and 31, right after the Wall Street crash halted U.S. loans to Europe and thereby threw thousands of Berliners out of work. To dramatize the ruthlessness of capitalism, Brecht sets his title character against the very embodiment of capitalist exploitation, a tycoon named Pierpont Moeller, who despises workers and who dominates the Chicago meat market by manipulating prices in response to telegrams from New York. Against him stands Joan d'Arc, a lieutenant in the Salvation Army, who sees for herself the misery of workers and who finally concludes that radical change alone can meet their needs. Shouting to be heard at the end above the voices of capitalists, she proclaims her faith in the communist gospel of violent resistance. Only force can help where force prevails. In 1931, even while finishing St. Joan of the Stockyards, Brecht wrote his first play about a mother roused to political action. In The Mother, set in Tsarist Russia and based on a novel by Maxim Gorky, the title character undergoes a conversion to the revolutionary cause. Brecht called the play a sociological experiment in revolutionizing the mother. As such, it anticipates a play sparked by the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War in 1936, when General Francisco Franco launched a fascist rebellion against the Spanish Republic. In Senora Carrar's Rifles, which Brecht finished by March of 1937, the title character is a mother who turns into a militant. At first, she tries to keep both of her sons out of the war. But when her older son is killed, she radically changes, goading the younger one to fight and even joining the fight herself. When a German-language production of the play opened in Paris in October 1937, with civil war still raging in Spain, the advertising poster proclaimed, "Brecht's new work is dedicated to the Spanish people's heroic battle for freedom." The Paris production of this stirring play no doubt gained from the presence of Helene Weigel, Brecht's second wife, in the title role. Brecht so much admired her performance that he wrote poems to celebrate it. Nevertheless, Senora Carrar's Rifles marks a detour from the road that Brecht started traveling back in 1925 when he wrote A Man is a Man. The hero of that play, a wacky Irish porter named Gaily Gay, exemplifies what Brecht called a new human type. He survives by adapting to circumstances, by lying and superficially complying rather than by openly resisting oppression or saying what he really thinks. This type of character resurfaces in Life of Galileo, a play that Brecht wrote just a little over a year after Senora Carrar's Rifles, in collaboration with Margaret Stephan, one of his many lovers, in fact. The whole topic of Brecht's relation to women as wives, mistresses, collaborators, and leading figures in his plays, this whole topic could easily fill the rest of my time for this lecture. But since I've only got half an hour for all of Brecht, let me say just a word on the kind of hero he creates in Life of Galileo. Loosely based on the great Italian astronomer who lived from 1564 to 1642, the title character declines to be a hero. Though he proclaims a new age of scientific discovery at the beginning of the play, he eventually bows to the authority of the Roman Catholic Church. To save his life, he renounces his revolutionary teaching that the earth moves around the sun. But since he's allowed to spend the last 10 years of his life under house arrest, he works on like an old fox. While seeming to gratify all the wishes of the authorities and letting them lock up his new manuscript page by page, he secretly makes a copy that is smuggled out of the country by his pupil Andrea, who comes to see that Galileo's hands are still productive, even if they are also stained. "Better stained than empty," says Galileo. Sounds realistic. Sounds like me. A new science, a new ethics. By the fall of 1938, when he wrote Galileo, Brecht was more than ever bent on creating a new kind of protagonist in a new kind of drama for a very dark time. 5 years earlier, Brecht had fled Germany with his wife and little boy on February 28, 1933, right after the Nazis burned the Reichstag and blamed the fire on the communists as a pretext for arresting 4,000 of them. During the late 30s, which Brecht and his family spent mostly in Denmark and Sweden, he not only showed his admiration for communism and revolutionary violence in plays like Signora Carrar's Rifles, he also voiced his hatred of Hitler in anti-Nazi sketches like Fear and Misery of the Third Reich, written in March of '38. But we must always be wary of categorizing Brecht. Even though he hated Nazism and admired communism, he had no intention of simply dramatizing communist propaganda or heeding the rules of socialist realism, which ordered writers to treat socialist society in terms of upbeat, conventional realism. No such rules could bind the imagination of Bertolt Brecht. Nor did he feel himself bound to cheer Soviet Russia. Though briefly enchanted with the prospects for theater in Moscow, which he once considered the only theatrical city in the world, he was nonetheless dismayed to learn by June of 1938 that many of Moscow's theater professionals had been brutally crushed, in some cases tortured or killed. Add to this the growing threat of a Second World War, and you can understand why Brecht, in his poetry of this period, calls the years 1938 and 1939 the dark times and a bad time for poetry. But a dark time needs the light of poetry and of drama. In late September of 1939, just weeks after Germany invaded Poland and thus ignited the Second World War, Brecht started writing one of the most remarkable anti-war plays ever created, Mother Courage. It thus takes its place with two other major works of literature written during a global war, James Joyce's Ulysses and Albert Camus' The Plague. Started in 1914, when the First World War broke out, and finished a few years after it ended, Joyce's Ulysses features a resolutely pacifist hero whose most heroic moment comes when he denounces war as the enemy of life itself. Force, hatred, history, all that, he says, that's not life for men and women, insult and hatred. Camus' The Plague likewise treats war as the enemy of life by implicitly comparing it to a plague. Started in 1941, 2 years after the Second World War began, and finished soon after the war ended, Camus' novel, as we will see, tells the story of a doctor who fought a devastating outbreak of bubonic plague with only the weapons of medical care. His story, we are told at the end, was the record of what had to be done, and what assuredly would have to be done again in the never-ending fight against terror and its relentless onslaughts, done by all those who, while unable to be saints, but refusing to bow down to pestilences, strive their utmost to be healers. Brecht's wagon-driving mother makes no effort to heal the victims of war or plague. But neither does she beat the drums for war or revolutionary violence. Unlike the title characters in Brecht's The Mother and Signora Carrar's Rifles, she does not want her children to fight, and she loathes anything that smacks of heroism in the conventional sense of the word. Early in the play, she learns that one of her sons has won the admiration of a general by tricking and then killing 4 peasants who surrounded him as he tried to steal their oxen. In response to this news, Mother Courage slaps him in the face, not for stealing the oxen, but, as she says, for not surrendering when the 4 of them were threatening to make hash of you. Didn't I teach you to take care of yourself, you finished devil? In spite of her name, Mother Courage views death-defying courage as simply foolhardy. She might as well be called Mother Play It Safe. And because she insists that survival is far more important than any kind of military heroism, she complicates our response to her. We can't applaud her in anything like the way we applaud a mother who urges her son to fight in a noble cause, such as the war against fascism in Spain. Instead, we might applaud her for reinforcing the anti-war message of the play as a whole, which relentlessly exposes the folly, the futility, and the brutality of war. But here we run head-on into a major problem with Mother Courage. As a woman who makes her living by running a shop on wheels for any fighting man who wants to buy her goods, she is something that most of us normally detest, a war profiteer. In Camus' The Plague, one of the lesser characters is a man who profits from the plague and ultimately comes to a disgraceful end. I don't know whether Camus ever saw or read this play, but the idea that a war profiteer could be the hero or heroine of any work of literature, let alone an anti-war play, would have astounded him. But that, believe it or not, is just the point. For years before writing Mother Courage, Brecht had been waging a personal war against what he called Aristotelian, empathy drama. This kind of drama strives to make us empathize or identify with the protagonist, or, as Aristotle suggests in his theory of tragedy, to make us pity the protagonist and feel his or her fear within ourselves. For the most part, this is not what Brecht wanted his plays to do. Even though the title figures in The Mother and Signora Carrar's Rifles are clearly meant to win our empathy, Brecht chiefly sought to revolutionize drama by purging it of sentimentality, by forestalling our identification with the main character, by making us see the character's faults rather than just feeling his or her pain, anguish, and perseverance. So as Brecht conceived it, his epic theater strives to detach us from the emotional life of his characters, or at the very least to tie us up in a self-contradictory knot of empathy and aversion. Now, if Aristotle were alive to hear about this theory of drama, he might claim to have anticipated it. Because in his own theory of tragedy, Aristotle argues that the suffering of a tragic hero must spring, at least in part, from a flaw or weakness of his own, a flaw that the hero must finally see for himself. But according to Brecht himself, Mother Courage fails to grasp the message of the play that is named for her because she never stops trying to make money out of the war. To see this point clearly, we need to understand just why Brecht chose to write about a 17th century war in the middle of the 20th century. Rightly or wrongly, Brecht saw the 30 Years' War as one of the first large-scale conflicts generated by capitalism. So for him, the 30 Years' War was the precursor of the 2 world wars of the 20th century. In writing a play about the ruinous effects of the 30 Years' War as the Second World War broke out, he might well have been acting on the words of George Santayana. He who does not know the past will be condemned to relive it. Brecht urgently wanted his countrymen to know what an earlier war had done to Germany, even if not even Brecht himself could foresee just how miserably they would relive its devastation. But this is not just a play meant to expose the horrors of war. It's meant to expose the unholy alliance between war and business. In Scene 3, Mother Courage herself says the religious pretexts for this war scarcely hide its true commercial aims. When you listen to the big wheels talk, she says, they're making war for reasons of piety in the name of everything that's fine and noble. But when you take another look, You see that they're not so dumb. They're making war for profit. If they weren't, the small fry like me wouldn't have anything to do with it. The last part of this speech shows how Mother Courage alienates us, how she turns away our sympathy for at least part of the time. Instead of being outraged by the hypocrisy of the big shots, by the gulf between their pretensions to piety and their lust for guilt, she seems to admire them. They're not so dumb. They're out for profit. And that's why we small fry are backing this war too. But according to Brecht, Mother Courage herself remains dumb in a fundamental way. She never learns the chief lesson that Brecht wanted to teach in this play, which is that no ordinary person can profit from the war. The big business deals that constitute war, he writes, are not made by the little people. Now, I've dwelled at length on what Brecht aimed to do in this play because he himself wrote at length about his aims and about the failure of his audiences to understand them. Fascinatingly enough, he was actually dismayed by the reaction to the first production of the play in 1940, when reviewers praised the heart-rending vitality of his mother animal. So he retouched certain scenes to make her sound more mercenary and to show that she is not indestructible. In Brecht's view, she is finally destroyed by the conflict between her maternal sympathies and her quest for profit. Brecht himself records that in the East Berlin production of 1949, which he co-directed, Helene Weigel played Mother Courage as, quote, a strong, crafty woman who loses her children to the war one after another and still goes on believing in the profit to be derived from the war. Many people saw that she failed to grasp the folly of this belief, but according to Brecht, they did not understand that her failure was, quote, the bitterest and most meaningful lesson of the play. They did not see, Brecht writes, that war teaches people nothing. Furthermore, he writes, not even those who saw the East Berlin production recognized the crimes of Mother Courage, her participation in war profiteering. They saw only her failure, Brecht writes, her sufferings. In blaming his audience for their failure to see the crimes of Mother Courage, Brecht obviously indicts his own title character and tells us how we should judge her. He thus presses us to adopt what has been called the intentional fallacy, the notion that we can judge any work of literature by seeing how well it fulfills the author's intention. More often than not, the problem with this way of judging literature is that we have no independent access to that intention, nothing outside the work itself that tells us what the author aimed to do in writing it. But when a playwright tells us exactly what lesson he wanted his play to teach and exactly how to judge his central character, he challenges us to test his stated aims, his stated intentions against our own experience of the play. Well, I never saw the Berlin production of Mother Courage or any other production of it directed by Brecht himself, so I can't say how well that production fulfilled his intentions. All I can do is judge the final version of his script in the collected edition of his plays. My own reading of the script leads me to a paradoxical hypothesis that I want to pursue with you. Mother Courage moves us precisely because it fails to do exactly what Brecht said he wanted it to do. The sheer complexity of his title character resists any formula, including his own, any formula that would categorize her as simply or even chiefly mercenary, as little more than a battlefield hyena feeding off the war. That is what she is called, a battlefield hyena. That's what she's called by the chaplain in scene 8, when she laments the news that peace has broken out. Having just bought more goods for her wagon, she's afraid that she'll be stuck with them and financially ruined. You don't want peace, says the chaplain. You want war because you profit by it. And if we want more evidence that Mother Courage cares more for profit than for humanity, we can find it in scene 5, when the chaplain begs her for linen to bandage the bleeding wounds of a peasant and his family. With all of her bandages sold, the only linen she's got in her wagon is officers' shirts, and she will not give them away. I'm not giving you anything, she says. You can't make me. I've got to think of myself. The chaplain has to lift her out of the way of the wagon to get his hands on the shirts. What can be said for such a woman? Does she utterly fail to see how brutal and dehumanizing war can be? Well, consider the end of scene 6, where she and the chaplain witness the funeral of Tilly, the field marshal of the Catholic imperial forces. When the chaplain calls the burial a historic moment, Mother Courage ruefully remarks on what she calls historic. Someone struck her mute daughter Catherine over the eye when Catherine was off buying goods for the wagon. She's a wreck. She'll never get a husband now. It's the war that made her dumb, too. A soldier stuffed something in her mouth when she was little. I'll never see Swiss cheese again, and where Eilif is, God knows. God damn the war. To see that she opens the very next scene by declaring that war is a better provider than peace is to see how impossibly conflicted this woman is. But the best place to look for the conflict between her mercantile aims and her maternal instincts is the scene from which I quoted at the beginning of this lecture, the scene where Mother Courage tries to buy back the life of her son, Swiss cheese. Let us now, at last, return to that scene. She's learned that the sergeant who captured her son may be willing to spare his life for a price. So she raises 200 guilders by mortgaging her wagon to Yvette, whose new boyfriend is a rich old colonel. Though Mother Courage will lose her wagon if she doesn't pay the money back in just 2 weeks, she thinks she can get it from the regimental cash box that her son had planned to hide away. But when she learns that he threw the box into the river, she reckons that she's lost her wagon. So she can't offer the whole 200 for a bribe. With herself and her unmarried daughter to support, she's simply got to have something left to live on. In desperation, she sends Yvette to offer just 120. When Yvette comes running back to say the soldiers won't take less than 200, Mother Courage sends her running off again with a promise to pay that whole amount. But the rumble of drums in the distance tell us that her son has already been sentenced. Yvette then returns to say he's been shot. Worse still, the soldiers suspect that Mother Courage and her daughter know him and are holding the cash box. They're going to bring him here, says Yvette. They think you'll give yourselves away when you see him. Now comes one of the most excruciating moments in the play. Knowing that she and her daughter may be killed if they show the least flicker of grief for her dead son, she must stand impassively, holding her daughter's hand as the soldiers carry in the sheeted corpse and remove the sheet, and the sergeant asks the women if they recognize him. When Mother Courage shakes her head in denial, Brecht suggests that the actor playing the sergeant can look around at his men in amazement at such hardness. But does her denial signify hardness alone? Knowing the price that she and her daughter would pay for showing any sign of grief, what can she do but steel herself against it? Instead of weeping or shrieking or lacerating herself for haggling over the life of her son, she must stoically pretend to feeling nothing. Does her would-be hardness destroy her humanity and make us despise her addiction to business and profit, or does it subtly lead us into the unspeakable depths of her anguish? I won't answer that question for you. Even if I had 2 hours for this lecture, I don't think I could answer it decisively myself. All I suggest is that Brecht's indictment of Mother Courage tells us far less than the play itself does, and that only in reading or seeing the play can we experience the whole truth of her character. The play shows more than her blindness to her own inhumanity. It shows instead how she herself becomes a battlefield where the struggle for profit and the need to survive wage endless war with maternal solicitude. So instead of regretting, as Brecht does, that his audience consistently fails to see her crimes, I believe that both her crimes and her suffering are revealed by the play itself, and that both are essential to its power. Irreducible to any one message, Brecht's play dramatizes the dehumanizing brutality of war by staging its effect on someone who feels that brutality even as she strives to make her living from it. In spite of his determination to keep our sympathies at bay, Brecht's play draws us right into the riven heart of its title character, making her embody the insoluble contradictions of a mother caught up in war.